Did Jesus answer his accusers, or did he keep silent in his trial? Bart Ehrman says in some places it says that he is silent, in some places it says that he talks. That's got to be a contradiction, right? If the document is, as many skeptics would say, full of contradictions, then it's not trustworthy, obviously. Well, we're going to look at the scriptures. Good morning or afternoon. Welcome to Church for Skeptics. This is Dan Arsenault here. I'm beginning a series, actually, kind of in a roundabout way, on the New Testament as history. How does the New Testament stack up in the light of just historical methods, like any other history would? How does it stack up? For that matter, how does the historical Jesus stack up when it just does history? How does history look at Jesus? I'm going to give you today just a summary of some things, and then we're going to pinpoint a certain thing, one of the tests. There are three basic tests for any ancient document as far as its validity, its veracity. One is the bibliographical test, and that just is, we want to know how many good copies we have of that. There are no originals. They call them autographs. There are no originals of virtually any that I know of, ancient documents. They're just all lost to the dust, long since gone. But do we have copies of those that are trustworthy? And of course, we'll talk about that regarding the New Testament in particular, the Bible in general. The second, and the one we're going to focus on today, is the internal test. If the document is, as many skeptics would say, full of contradictions, then it's not trustworthy, obviously. By the way, I use this a lot, to be self-contradicting is the worst kind of being wrong or incorrect. And so if the Bible has a lot of contradictions in it, that's a real problem. And then the third test is called the external test. And that just means, how does the New Testament, in this case, we're examining the New Testament, how does the New Testament line up with other ancient documents somewhere around that time? And when we do that, we have to look, what does the New Testament say regarding history compared to what, let's say, the Roman historian Tacitus said about his history, and Josephus, the Jewish historian. If you go to Wikipedia and you want to find out what happened in first century Palestine under the Roman Empire, Wikipedia will tell you that the two best sources are, number one, the New Testament, number two, Josephus. So you can see how they work together, and we'll use those often as well. Now we're focusing on test number two, the internal test. Does the New Testament, is it really full of contradictions? Well, the number one prosecutor, if you want to use it as a court of law analogy here, the number one prosecutor against the truthfulness, the veracity of the New Testament would be BART EHRMAN. BART EHRMAN is the head of the Department of Religion at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and an atheist. Now, in his own words, he would have been a believer in his younger days, but then doing his research as a textual critic, can we get good copies? And he says, no, we can't. The consensus view of scholarship is that we have very good copies of the original New Testament. There are a few verses that we don't know if the original were there, but none of them mean any difference. We'll do a whole session on the scribal errors in the Bible. But for now, we're talking about BART EHRMAN. I watched a video, and let me see if I can find it here. The video was of a myth. It's called the Myth Vision podcast. So you can imagine everything in Scripture is a myth, and maybe they talk about other myths outside of Scripture. But this one was an interview with BART EHRMAN. Now, the interviewer asked BART EHRMAN this: what are your three favorite Bible contradictions? Now, think about what that means. That means the number one prosecutor is giving his top three reasons to prosecute the defendant in this case being the Bible, in particular the New Testament. So if we can strike out Bart Ehrman, 1, 2, 3, his three favorites, that says a lot towards the nature of the skeptical community. And so we're going to talk about one today. Here's his number one, Bart Ehrman's number one accusation, is number one of his favorite contradiction in the New Testament. Did Jesus answer his accusers in his trial, or did he keep silent in his trial? Now, Bart Ehrman says in some places it says that he is silent. In some places it says that he talks. That's got to be a contradiction, right? Well, we're going to look at the scriptures. Bart Ehrman says we cannot harmonize the Gospels. You have the reason there are 4 Gospels because you have 4 independent eyewitness testimonies about the life and times and death and resurrection of Jesus. They're independent, just like they would be in a courtroom. Because of that, of course, there are differences. Some remember things a little differently. Some remember details a little differently. But as a whole, it's very, and especially if you harmonize it. But Bart Ehrman says you can't do that because, I guess, virtually because they're independent multiple sources, you can't put them together and see how they reconcile. I think that's just silly. I think that's what they're for reconciliation. So his first accusation would be then, did Jesus answer his accusers? Matthew chapter 26, verse 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus, that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At last 2 came forward and said, this man said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? Now watch, here's the first part. But Jesus remained silent. Okay, there you have it. Jesus didn't say anything. And the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Now, we're going to go to the next verse here, but before we move out of this verse, when it says here that Jesus remains silent, does that mean that he never speaks another word in his entire life? Does he become sort of deaf or a deaf mute after that? Does he hit the mute button after that and never says another thing? Is that what that verse means? I think it just means that he doesn't answer his accusers. And we're going to see that specifically, especially when we get to the next verse. Jesus said to him. This is not gospel versus gospel. This is all the same gospel. So in one verse it says Jesus was silent when in relationship to his accusers. Then it says Jesus said to him. He's talking to the high priest here. Now look what he says. You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And when he says those 3 things, the high priest, you'll see this, he will tear his clothes. The high priest was not allowed to do that except in the case of blasphemy. So on what Jesus said in the high priest view, he was claiming himself to be God because of these testimonies here. The Son of Man is an Old Testament title for the Messiah, the Christ. The seated at the right hand of power is a title for God. And then coming on the clouds of heaven, nobody does that in the Old Testament except God. In the trial of Jesus, in all the Gospels, by the way, he first goes to Annas, the former high priest that the people revered more than Caiaphas, was Annas' son-in-law, by the way. And so they go to Annas, then he sends them to Caiaphas. Then Caiaphas and all the elders and all the Sanhedrin, the ruling judges of the day, the Jewish ruling judges of the day, gather together and they condemn him. Then, because they cannot execute Jesus, they can't do the death penalty, the Romans wouldn't let them, they have to drag Jesus now to the governor, to Pontius Pilate, to try to get him on board with their program and their plan to get rid of Jesus altogether. Now, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "You have said so." There's that same word again. Yes, I am. But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. Does that mean Jesus never said anything after that? Yeah, it's obvious that's not the case, but it seems like that's what Bart Ehrman is trying to make the case for. That once Jesus is silent about one thing, he's silent the rest of it. And so anything else is a contradiction. You see contradictions here. And I have to tell you, I absolutely do not see any contradictions here. It's a great flow. Jesus, and here's the deal. Jesus doesn't answer his accusers, but he does affirm his identity as the Son of God, the Christ, the God in the flesh, actually. Then Pilate said to him, do they not hear how many things they testify against you? But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. There's no contradiction there. It's pretty obvious there's no contradiction there. So why would Bart Ehrman, the chairman of the Department of Religion at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, why would he try to turn this obvious harmonization here within its own gospel? And if you go to Mark, we haven't done this today, we don't have time, I don't think, but if you go to Mark and read the same thing happens. If you go to Luke, the same thing happens. If you go to the Gospel of John, John doesn't talk about the trial before Caiaphas and the high priest, but he does talk about his exchange with Pilate. And there's a little more information, but it's obvious Jesus talks, but he doesn't answer his accusers. He doesn't answer his defending himself against his accusations. He does affirm his identity. That's the way this skeptical idea works, is trying to find, I don't know, maybe make a mountain out of a molehill, and when there's not really any molehill there, of course it bothers me. I hope it bothers you as well. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again.